War, fascism, yearning for independence, and differing social ideologies were some of the components that culminated together to create the dark point in Spain's history known as the grueling Civil War. Before we even start to see how a nation split apart, we have to examine the acts of the country that led to its internal conflicts.
For centuries, the country of Spain was ruled solely under monarchy, but tensions began to rise during the early 19th century. Liberals pushed for less power from the monarchy since it was quite conservative at the time. The monarchy conceded, but not by much. It took until the 1870s when more radical groups formed to bring the idea of republicanism into the public and political eye.
Ironically enough, in the modern era, Spain has entered a constitutional monarchy where the monarchs are guided through parliament. Of the aforementioned radical groups, two of them include the Carlists and anarchists. In 1931, King Alfonso XII established a republic due to mounting pressure and a public fear of communism, which was greatly aggravated considering the First World War had occurred only around 15 years prior, and Spain had chosen to stay neutral and away from the matter. Now, why the Civil War came about, differing social ideologies. Most of us covered in the previous slide, but to simplify it, the Republicans wanted a government where the people had more say. The Nationalists wanted a reigning leader and to keep the monarchy going with influence behind the scenes from military generals. Now on to specify who the Republicans and the Nationalists were. First off, we have the Republicans and the People's Army. Now, who were they exactly? The Republican Party consisted of blue-collar workers and the middle class, many being labor workers. Though called the Republicans, their ideas were more aligned to an American understanding of the political left and democracy. Unfortunately for the Republicans, many of the already trained security and officers sided with the Nationalists, so the citizens themselves had to group together with little to no training. With formation being so sudden, the organization and communication was lackluster to say the least. Now, although the Republican side consisted mostly of the everyday citizens, they also had help from the International Brigade, or also known as Foreign Volunteers. So, the International Brigade. Most were working class despite rumors that many were poets. One soldier even rumored to be Ernest Hemingway, though it was proven false. In actuality, most were communists, and though their casualties were great and their morality wayward, they were quite a force. Not enough to help secure a win, though. Despite being unimpressive, the People's Army held out for 2 years. Lack of exact mutual ideologies led to infighting between the troops themselves. Although both sides had international intervention, the Nationalists had Franco as their leader who was unchallenged by the Axis powers leaders, whereas for their assistance, the Soviet Union wanted their own people leading the Republicans' play, and the United States didn't really help all that much besides sending soldiers who didn't really want to be there in the first place. On the right is shown a poster that was spread widely on the western side of the country of Spain, and a rough translation of the poster reads, "The Internationals, united with Spaniards, we fight against the invader." Now on to the Nationalists and their own international intervention. Now, who were they? The Nationalists were white-collared workers with a fair amount of business knowledge, upper-class citizens who were vehemently against communism and benefited greatly from capitalism. Most were lawyers, bankers, and military officials. They were also mainly Roman Catholics. To make matters easier, the Nationalists would be seen as right-wing politically. They received help from fascist France and Nazi Germany, who sent over soldiers and weapons and were providing military aid to Nationalist Spain, who didn't have much of a military to begin with. Now on to the probability of a win for either side. Both the Republicans and the Nationalists were aware that they would not have a quick, easy battle to settle their differences, considering the less than stellar military power Spain had at the time, which is why they both sought international intervention. Now, while a lot of Republicans did have a drive to lead the liberal agenda forward, a semi-decent morale is not enough to guarantee a win in war. The Republicans had a lack of a strong enough willpower or organization of any kind. They had no control over the distribution of food supplies, and they were using the gold reserves that they'd been in charge of prior to the start of the war to buy weapons off of the Soviet Union, since Stalin would only deal in direct gold deposits. Even then, the weapons the Republicans received from Stalin were often of terrible quality and bought at an exorbitant price. The Nationalists were the opposite of the Republicans, since they blatantly had more manpower, had most of the Council of Defense, so they were an organized, skilled, and well-equipped machine. Speaking of machines, Germany sent over new machinery such as vehicles and tanks to test out, while Italy sent around 80,000 soldiers and over 600 planes. Comparatively, the nationalists also had a way to pay back the Axis powers' help through loans instead of using the National Gold Reserve. Now on to the main players of the war itself. Francisco Franco. He was a dictator that rose to power due to the turmoil from the war and controlled Spain until his death 36 years later in 1975. Franco was a Spanish general, conservatist, and monarchist. Part of a couple failed coups, the generals who died during those failures were the reason Franco was able to rise to power for his faction of the revolt. He was a clear leader for the nationalists because he refused to side too closely with any subgroup, letting himself to merge the groups together despite some political indifferences such as whether the country would continue as a dictatorship or a monarchy again. Now, there were more military generals within the war itself, but almost none of them had the same recognition as Francisco Franco himself. The closest to his level would be Gonzalo Cuerpo de Llano, who had 500 cannons that shot on average 13,500 rounds at Republicans daily during the Battle of Ebro, which was the most major battle of the entire war. The Republicans had a rough time finding leaders since most of the generals of the country had gone with the nationalists, as previously stated. Vicente Rojo was promoted quickly, major to chief of general staff in just a year's time. And then Juan Madeso was 30 years young, commandeering 30,000 people army. Other leaders included Juan Negrin, who was at the Battle of Ebro, Manuel Lazana, Francisco Alardo Caballero, Indalecio Prieto, and Jose Miaja, who all contributed small battles, yet almost none were recognized as leading figures. Although the war spanned from 1936 to 1939, there were only about 4 or 5 major events that occurred during the time period. The war officially began on July 17, 1936, when Franco began a revolt to overthrow the leftist government and called for the support of military officials. Much of northern Spain and important cities in the south were captured within just 3 days. Madrid was put under the protection of the International Brigade and remained in the hands of the Republicans until the end of the war. It was one of the main populous cities, which continues to be true to this day. In 1937, the Nationalists declared themselves with the Fascist Party, while the Republicans were with the Communists. This would be how the foreign powers would come and intervene after each side looked for help. In 1938 is when the Battle of Ebro would occur, which was the largest and longest battle of the whole war, spanning from April to mid-November of that year. Aiming to conquer Madrid, Franco launched a campaign towards Valencia, with the Republicans responding with an early attack, knowing the capital of Madrid was already under immense pressure. 80,000 Republican troops, along with the 15th Battalion of the International Brigade, were sent to intercept the Nationalists and held out for months with a great amount of casualties. On 23rd September, Juan Negrin announced that the foreign aid would be sent away and the remaining Republican troops were forced to receive the attack thrust upon them by General Gonzalo Cuerpo de Llano, until they could hold out no longer and retreated. Of those who remained, 6,500 were killed while almost 30,000 were heavily wounded. In 1939, a major attack is formed against Catalonia, which was under Republicans' rule, and the capital of Barcelona falls, with the rest of Catalonia being captured as well. The official end of the war was on March 28, 1939, when the Republicans surrendered Madrid, which was working as their capital at the moment. No compromise was made, even though Republicans did try to negotiate a peace deal, and Spain was launched into tumultuous dictatorship under Franco that lasted till his death on November 20, 1975. In the aftermath of the war, the casualties were immense and Republicans were persecuted. Thousands were imprisoned, and at the very least 30,000 were executed, separate from just purely military and civilian deaths. Those who were not executed fled from Spain and went to France, an estimated 500,000. Shortly after the end of Civil War, Second World War began, and although Spain never officially joined the Axis powers, Spain did provide some help to Germany through the Blue Division, which were soldiers sent to fight on the Eastern Front to thank them for support during their own war. An estimated 500,000 to 1 million were killed. In conclusion, the war was quite short in the grand scheme of things. Only 3 years long, yet the result would leave Spain devastated for years to come. A battle of politics and social ideologies had formed years prior, and it was only a matter of time before the issue became too big to ignore. The outside factors of the First World War only escalated the tension, though ultimately Spain wasn't even associated with it. The Spanish Civil War was a mess that ultimately brought about a dictatorship that would last decades.